The first thing you notice in a hospital isn't the smell of antiseptic, it's the silence between footsteps, the way sound travels differently depending on who you are in that building. I learned that on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in the hallway outside cardiothoracic suite B at Mercy General, holding a coffee I hadn't touched yet, wearing scrubs that still had a crease in them because I'd ironed them the night before. Old habit from my mother. She always said, you dress like you belong somewhere before anyone decides you do. His family was already there. I'd seen them from the elevator, the way they spread out across the waiting area like they owned the floor. My boyfriend's sister had this way of taking up space that I'd never quite gotten used to, even after 2 years. She was tall, the kind of tall that reads as authority in a room, and she had the same jaw as him, sharp and certain. She was a hospital administrator, not here, not at Mercy General, but at Riverside across town. She knew the language. She knew which doors opened and which ones didn't. She saw me walk off that elevator, and I watched her eyes move from my face to my badge to my face again. "Oh," she said, loud enough? Not to me, really. To the room. "She's here too." Her mother, my boyfriend's mother, turned and gave me that smile I'd gotten for 2 years. The one that started at the lips and stopped there. "We didn't know you'd be working today," his sister said. "I always work Tuesdays," I said. She tilted her head a little, the way people do when they're deciding whether to say the real thing or the polite version of it. She chose the real thing. "Right," she said. "Well, we'll try to stay out of your way." She said your way like she was talking about a cart in a grocery store aisle. I smiled and walked past them toward the nurse's station and did not let my hand shake when I set my coffee down on the counter. My boyfriend was somewhere in pre-op. He'd been admitted 2 days before. Routine cardiac catheterization that had turned less routine when they found a secondary blockage nobody expected. It was serious but managed. The attending had told his family there was nothing to worry about. The procedure was scheduled for 10, 2 hours out. A senior resident would assist. Everything was set. I was a second-year surgical resident, cardiothoracic, 18 months into a program that had taken me 6 years of fighting to get into. His family didn't know that. In 2 years, my boyfriend had never corrected them when they assumed I was a nurse. The first time it happened, I'd been too surprised to say anything. After that, it became this quiet thing between us, this thing I kept waiting for him to address and he kept not addressing, and I kept telling myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he knew, that we knew, that titles were just labels. You tell yourself a lot of things when you love someone. His sister had been a hospital administrator for 11 years. She understood, better than almost anyone, the difference between the people who cut, and the people who assist, and the people who clean up after. She had sorted me into a category and closed the file. I went to check on my other patient, a 63-year-old retired school teacher named Mr. Beaumont, who was waiting on a valve replacement and had been asking me every morning for a week if I thought his hydrangeas would survive the first frost without him there to cover them. I told him his neighbors sounded very capable. He laughed and said capable wasn't the same as caring. I thought about that longer than I should have. At 9:14, my pager went off. I still remember the exact sequence of what happened next because I've gone over it so many times it's worn smooth in my memory, like a stone you've carried too long. The attending on my boyfriend's case. Dr. Harmon, brilliant surgeon, 22 years in cardiothoracic, had been in a car accident on his way in. Not serious, he was fine, but his right hand had taken the impact against the steering wheel. He couldn't operate. The senior resident who was supposed to assist had been pulled into an emergency on 4. The second resident assigned to the case had called in sick. The chief of cardiothoracic surgery, Dr. Trafter O. Thoracic Surgery, Voss, who did not have a gentle bedside manner, but had hands that could do things that made other surgeons stand still and watch, was already in a 12-hour complex repair that had started at 6 a.m. and could not be safely interrupted. The procedure needed to happen. The secondary blockage had shown instability overnight. Waiting another day carried real risk. I was paged to the chief resident's office at 9:17. Dr. Reyes, our chief resident, was sitting behind her desk with the expression she got when she was doing math in her head that she didn't like the answer to. She looked at me for a moment before she spoke. "You've done 14 cath-guided interventions?" she said, including 2 as secondary blockage presentations. 15, I said, the one on Friday. She nodded slowly. How do you feel about your last echo read on this case? The collateral formation is clean. The secondary site is accessible. It's not a simple case, but it's not, I know what it is, she said. I reviewed it this morning. She was quiet for a second. There's a complication, she said. The patient, I said, is my boyfriend. She looked at me. I know who the patient is, I said. I've been recusing myself from his care for 2 days. I haven't reviewed his charts since admission. I am telling you right now, fully disclosed, he is my boyfriend of 2 years. If there's anyone else, there isn't, she said. Not with your specific profile on this case type. Not today. She paused. This is your call. I will not order you into that room. I thought about the hydrangeas. I thought about his mother's half smile. I thought about his sister's voice carrying across that waiting room, the way your way had sounded, the category she put me in without ever asking what I'd spent 6 years of my life building. I thought about him. In pre-op. Probably scared even though he wouldn't say so. Get me the attending's notes, I said. I want 15 minutes with the imaging before we start. The scrub nurse's name was Yolanda, and she had been in that OR longer than most of the attendings. She didn't say anything when I walked in. She just handed me the gown, and we moved through the prep the way you do when you've done it enough times that your body knows before your brain catches up. The anesthesiologist was a quiet man named Dr. Park who I'd worked with 3 times before. He nodded once when I entered. That was enough. I stood at the table and looked at the imaging one more time. 15 interventions. I knew what I was looking at. I knew what the catheter would feel like in my hand. I knew the resistance. I knew the exact moment you hold and the exact moment you advance. I thought about the fact that the person on this table had held my hand at my grandmother's funeral 8 months ago. I let myself think about that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I put it somewhere else. Not gone, just somewhere else. You learn to do that in this work. You have to. Okay, I said. Let's begin. It took 2 hours and 11 minutes. There's a moment in a procedure like that when the imaging clears, when you can see the flow restore, when the data on the screen shifts and the numbers start moving in the right direction, and it's not dramatic the way people imagine it. There's no music, there's no swelling feeling in your chest. There's just the numbers, and Dr. Park's quiet voice calling them out, and the steady rhythm of the monitors. Good, I said. Yolanda made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. We closed in another 40 minutes. Clean. No complications. I stood in the scrub room afterward with the water running over my hands, and I stared at the tile on the wall, and I let myself feel it for a minute. All of it. The fear I hadn't let myself feel in there, the strange vertigo of knowing that the hands that just did that work were mine, that I had made those decisions and they had been the right ones, that the person I loved was going to wake up and be okay. Then I turned off the water and dried my hands. His family was in the surgical waiting room on 3 when Dr. Reyes went out to speak with them. I wasn't there for that conversation. I was in the resident lounge writing my post-op notes, which took me 45 minutes because my hands had finally started shaking and I kept having to stop and breathe. His sister came to find me. I heard the door open and looked up, and she was standing there in the frame of it, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She was a different kind of present than she'd been that morning. Something had gone out of her posture, something that had been holding it all up. They told us, she said. I nodded. They told us it was you. Yes. She stood there for a moment. Her hands were clasped in front of her. How long have you? I'm a second-year cardiothoracic surgical resident, I said. I've been a surgical resident for 18 months. Before that, medical school for 4 years. Before that, he never said. No, I said. He didn't. She looked at me with something I didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't shame exactly. It was something quieter and harder than shame. I said something this morning, she said. You did? I didn't know. I thought about all the ways I could answer that. About all the times over 2 years that the information had been available to anyone who'd wanted to look at it. About every dinner where I'd deflected questions about my work because he'd given me this small look, this slight shake of his head, this not now. About how I convinced myself that was about privacy and not about what it was actually about. "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it. That was the complicated part. She hadn't known because nobody had told her, and nobody had told her because the person who should have was more comfortable with her not knowing. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did today." "He's my patient," I said. "That's what I do." She nodded and left. He was out of recovery by 7 that evening. I went in after his family had their time with him. The room had that post-anesthesia quiet, the kind of muted, gray-edged peace that settles over a person when the worst is behind them. He turned his head when I came in. His eyes were still slow from the medication. "Hey," he said. "Hey, they told me." His voice was thin. "That you don't," I said, not unkindly, "not tonight." He looked at me for a long moment. "I should have, yeah," I said. "You should have." I sat down in the chair next to his bed. We stayed like that for a while. I thought about 2 years of small silences. 2 years of not now, 2 years of loving someone, and also slowly, quietly disappearing inside that love. I thought about his sister's voice in that waiting room and how it had landed in my chest and how I had kept walking and done my job anyway. "My sister called you, she implied." I know what she implied. He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry. The thing about being a surgical resident is that you learn very quickly what things look like from the inside and what they look like from the outside. You learn that the view changes depending on where you're standing." His sister had stood somewhere and seen something and made a judgment with the information she had. That wasn't entirely her fault. What was his fault was that he'd had all the information and chosen, over and over, not to share it. I didn't say all of that. Some things you don't say in a recovery room. "Get some rest," I said. "We can talk later." I meant it. I also knew, sitting there in that chair, that later was going to be a different kind of conversation than either of us had been having. That some things that had been comfortable and unspoken for 2 years were going to have to come into the light now, and that whatever we looked like on the other side of that conversation might not look like what we'd been before. That was okay. I was 31 years old. I had 15 cardiac interventions on my record. I had spent 6 years fighting for a program that had not been built with me in mind, and 18 months proving I belonged in it. And today I had stood at a table in Suite B and made decisions that were the right decisions under conditions that would have unmade a lot of people. I was not invisible. I had never been invisible. The only question was whether the people around me had been choosing not to see. 3 days later, I was paged to Dr. Voss's office, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, the one whose 12-hour repair had overlapped with everything. He was a man of few words and almost no visible affect, which residents generally read as terrifying until you understood it as simply being the result of having done this for 30 years and having long ago made peace with the things you can and cannot control. He had read my post-op report. He had reviewed the imaging from before and after. He told me that the intervention had been technically clean, that my judgment calls at 2 specific decision points in the procedure were what he would have made, that the documentation was thorough. He said this looking at a point slightly above my head, in the way that Dr. Voss delivered what passed for his highest compliments. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and looked back at his desk, which meant I was dismissed. I walked out of his office and stood in the hallway for a moment. The sound of the floor moved around me, carts, voices, the particular percussion of a hospital in the middle of a day, and I felt something settle into place inside me, something that had been slightly out of alignment for a long time. Not because he'd said it, not because I needed him to say it, but because I knew it was true, and it was good to know that what I knew and what was real were the same thing. My boyfriend's sister sent me a text 4 days after the procedure. She'd gotten my number from him. It said, "I owe you more than an apology. I'd like to take you to lunch when he's stronger, if you're willing. I have a lot to say and I'd rather say it to your face." I stared at it for a while on my lunch break, sitting in the resident lounge with bad vending machine coffee that I'd stopped noticing tasted bad somewhere around month 4 of residency. I thought about the morning in that hallway. will try to stay out of your way. The half smile. The assumption. I type back, I like that, I meant it. Not because everything was fixed, not because a lunch undoes 2 years of quiet erasure, but because the willingness to sit across from someone and say the real thing, to choose the harder version of a conversation over the comfortable version, is something I understood. It was what I asked of myself every day in that building. It was the least I could extend to someone else. A week later, his mother stopped by the unit with a plant, a small potted orchid in a pale yellow pot. She gave it to the charge nurse to pass to me because she didn't know my schedule, which meant she'd had to ask someone what my schedule was, which meant she'd had to learn, first, that I had one. There was a card. It said, "Thank you for bringing my son back." Carol, just that. 4 words and a name. I put the orchid on the windowsill in the resident lounge where the afternoon light hit it. The other residents asked where it came from. I said a patient's family. That was true enough. Mr. Beaumont, my valve replacement patient, was discharged on a Thursday. He told me on his way out that his neighbor had, in fact, covered the hydrangeas. All of them. Without being asked. Capable and caring, he said, pointing at me like he was making a point. Get some rest, I told him. He laughed all the way to the elevator. I stood at the window for a moment after he left and watched the light on the parking lot below. October had gone. November was doing what November does in this part of the country. Gray and deliberate, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. My pager went off. I picked it up and read the number and started walking. That's the thing about this work, there's always somewhere to be. There's always the next thing, the next room, the next decision. You don't get to stand at windows for very long, but for that one moment, before I turned away, I let myself have it. The orchid in the yellow pot, the afternoon light, the knowledge of what my hands had done and what they would keep doing, long after anyone in that waiting room remembered what they'd assumed about me on a Tuesday morning in October. I had never been there to mop floors. I had always been exactly where I was supposed to be. I've thought a lot about what it actually costs to be invisible for a long time, not the dramatic kind of invisible, not the kind that comes with a clear villain and a clean story, the quiet kind, the kind where you let it happen because someone you love seems more comfortable when you do. That Tuesday morning in October, when his sister's voice carried across that waiting room and landed where it landed, I made a choice I'd been making for 2 years. I kept walking. I set my coffee down. I did my job. What was different that day wasn't her, it was me. Something had been settling in me for a long time without my noticing, the way a foundation either holds or it doesn't, and you don't always know which, until something heavy lands on it. The thing about cause and effect. Real cause and effect, the kind that plays out over years, and not just moments, is that it's almost never loud. His sister didn't say what she said because she was cruel. She said it because nobody had ever handed her different information. That was the real chain of events. Not one mean comment in a hallway, but 2 years of my boyfriend choosing comfort over truth. Over and over in small ways that felt harmless until they weren't. Every time he let an assumption pass uncorrected, he added one more layer to something that was eventually going to have to come apart. And it did. What I keep coming back to is the 3 things that actually got me through that day. Not luck, not talent in isolation, not some speech I gave myself in a mirror. The first was the work. The 18 months of residency, the 15 procedures, the hours in the library at midnight before anyone was watching. You cannot manufacture competence in a crisis. You either built it or you didn't, and the building happens in all the ordinary, unglamorous days when there's no one to see it and no immediate reward. That's what I mean when I think about integrity. Not the word people use in speeches, but the actual thing, which is what you do when there's nothing to prove and no one to perform for. The second was honesty, my own, first. Walking into Dr. Permai Reyes's office and saying out loud, before she could ask, "This is my boyfriend, I am disclosing this, here is my record, here is my read on the case," I could have said nothing. I could have let it be handled around me. But I'd spent 2 years learning what happens when people choose the comfortable silence over the honest one. I didn't want to be that. The third thing is harder to name. It's something like, The refusal to let someone else's ceiling become your floor. His sister had placed me in a category and closed the file. I could feel that when she looked at me. And there is something in a person that, when pressed, either accepts that ceiling or does not. I did not. Not out of anger. Anger is a short fuel. It burns fast and leaves you empty. But out of something quieter and longer lasting, something that sounded like, I know what I have built. I know what I am capable of. And I am going to walk into that room and do it. Carol's orchid is still on the windowsill in the resident lounge. It's bloomed twice since October. Nobody's moved it. I think about Mr. Beaumont sometimes and what he said about capable versus caring. I think he was right that they're different things. But I also think the best version of this work, the best version of most things, really, is when you refuse to choose between them. When you bring both into the room. When you are precise and you are present and you do not let the noise in the hallway follow you through the door. That's the whole lesson maybe. You don't get to control who sees you or what they assume. You only get to control what you build when nobody's looking and whether you walk into the room anyway. I walked in.